Hello, my name is Jen Sunshine here with my dear friend and longtime creative partner, David Ng, and together we are the co-artistic directors of Love Intersections, a media arts collective that produces intersectional and intergenerational film and artwork from underrepresented communities. We're also founding members of the Vancouver Artists Labor Union Cooperative, also known as Value Co-op, which is an artist-run worker cooperative whose goal is to provide flexible living wage income to artists. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that we are gathered here today from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Part of our work as labor activists and queer artists on unceded territories means working in solidarity with ongoing Indigenous struggles for sovereignty, decolonization, reparations, and land back. Hot Pot Talks emerged during the pandemic from our collaboration with the Lim Association in Chinatown, historically a neighborhood of Chinese railroad laborers who were brought to settle Indigenous territories as part of the ongoing colonial project.
So why Hot Pot Talks? As Jen mentioned, Value Co-op has a studio located in the Lim Sai Hor Khao Mok Society building. And when we moved into the Chinatown neighborhood, Value Co-op, we had long conversations about the role that artists have played in gentrifying the neighborhood. And so part of our intention of moving into the neighborhood is also to build reciprocal relationships with the neighborhood and to the broader community as well. And so over the past 2 years, we've been collaborating with the Lim Association on a project to digitize their archives and to create a series of artworks that invites people to learn and engage with their positionality to Chinatowns. With the increased conversations about anti-Asian racism recently, the past 2 years have brought to surface already existing yellow peril narratives, re-emerging again during the pandemic. We've seen Chinatowns and elders targeted by racial violence and vandalism. We've seen the rise of boba liberal organizing around #StopAsianHate, demands for hate crime legislation, which is pro-police, pro-surveillance that harms Black and Indigenous communities. We've seen gentrification eating away the souls of Chinatowns and other BIPOC communities, seemingly with no end in sight. This season, we'll touch on themes of diaspora, xenophobia, systemic racism, intersectional solidarity building, and Chinatown futurities.
Before I introduce our guest, I want to thank our incredible team, Ava and Cameron, behind the scenes who helped make Hot Pot Talks a reality. Tara Teng is an embodiment coach who works in the intersections of spirituality and sexuality. She helps people find their way back to their bodies, overcome shame, heal trauma, and dismantle purity culture in a way that is in alignment with their values and beliefs so that they can build a healthy sexual ethic and thrive in freedom and wholeness. Aside from her one-on-one coaching, Tara hosts women's circles, workshops, online classes, and retreats throughout Vancouver, BC on the topics of embodiment, justice, sexuality, and relationships. Currently, Tara is writing her first book, Your Body is a Revolution, Healing Our Relationships with Our Bodies, Each Other, and the Earth. Available everywhere in 2023 from Broadleaf Books. Welcome, Tara.
Hi, Tara.
How are you doing today?
I'm great.
Yeah.
I'm excited to be with you guys.
Yeah, maybe Tara, we're so excited to talk to you. I mean, I have my own personal story to, my own experiences with purity culture, but maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about your work and maybe your journey to how you got to doing the work that you're doing around embodiment as spiritual practice.
Yeah. So I grew up in a very religious family. I was a daughter of a pastor, and so much of my story was woven into the church. That was my whole upbringing. And so I grew up in a religion that, while it might have started when we look at its ancient and really BIPOC roots, now it's become over time very colonialized. It's become very disembodied, very disconnected from the body, even fearful from the body. So I grew up with those kind of that perspective and that ideology that I was presented with from a really young age. And so my relationship with my body, like most of us, was complex. It was complex. It was layered. It was colonized in a lot of ways. And so growing up and now doing the work to deconstruct my faith and to step back and look at all the different pieces of my faith and my values, to see what is in alignment, to see what is not in alignment, and to see how can I come back into relationship with my most authentic, embodied self, my most human self, where I can strip away all the pieces of who I am that actually don't belong to me, but are someone else's expectations, that are someone else's ideas that have been imposed or expected of me, and even things in my personality that don't actually come from me, but are adaptations because of trauma.
Yeah.
Going through that whole journey has allowed me to look at my life, my values, the pieces of who I am, my emotional side, my mental side, the intelligence that I have, the sexuality that I have, the beliefs that I have, all of these different pieces of who I am. And to be able to heal the things that did not come from me and be able to come back into this place of wholeness and embodiment. And so that's what has brought me onto this journey. And through that, now I've been able to help others who are in a similar space of questioning, of wondering, what is my truest, most authentic self? How do I find that? How do I embody that? How do I heal from the things that are limiting beliefs that are holding me back? And to be able to kind of act as like a midwife almost for other people on that journey, helping them ask the right questions and get to a place where they feel that they've met themselves, maybe for the first time.
Wow.
That's funny. There's an inside joke in the queer community where if you're kind of widening or expanding people's experiences in their queerness, we call it you're a queer doula. So I like the kind of analogy of you're the midwife or the doula. Yeah.
Well, I am a birth doula as well. I'm trained as a birth keeper as well.
Amazing.
And so I just had my third baby. I'm just 3 weeks postpartum. And so I really love those birth analogies, because whether you choose to biologically have a child or not, or raise a child in any kind of parenting capacity, there's work that we do even within ourselves to birth new things every day. Right. And sometimes that labor is hard. It's intensive. It's hard work. And so I think it's so beautiful whether it be within me or, within the community, or whether within each other, to celebrate those new things that we're giving birth to and to watch them take on lives of their own.
I'm curious if you have if you can describe a day, because I'm sure we're all human, you have good days and bad days, but what is a day for you? What does it look like when you are embodied and feel in alignment with yourself?
I think I just feel alive. You feel like when every cell of your body feels like it's almost singing, to give it a poetic term. It just feels like you're so alive and you're in the moment, you're in your body, you're not up in your head analyzing all the things, or having my anxiety go, well, what about this, or what about this, or what about this, or trying to control a situation. But I can actually be present in the moment, present in my body, feeling the fullness of that experience. That's when I'm feeling most embodied. And that's the good side of the spectrum, right? The beautiful things of embodiment. But it's equally embodied when I allow myself to feel the depths and the hard parts of being human, the parts where I feel poured out, or I feel depleted, or in pain, or empty, to allow myself to feel the full spectrum of the range of human emotions and human experiences. That's embodiment, whether you're on one end of the spectrum or whether you're on the other. Like you said, we all have bad days, right? But allowing myself to lean into that, to not pull away or disassociate or disconnect from, but to feel safe enough to be present in that fullness of that experience, that to me is embodiment.
Tara, as I mentioned, I have a personal connection to this, and I'm curious because I'll share a little bit of I guess my story. It's connected to how we started Love Intersections too. But I grew up in a fundamentalist evangelical Christian church, and just to give our viewers just a little sense of the type, what is a background of purity culture. And Tara, I'm sure you probably remember the I Kiss Dating Goodbye days.
Wait,
what textbook?
It's this really famous now the author has recanted what he wrote, but it's a really famous book in the 90s and early 2000s that came up that was sort of the pinnacle of like what was considered quote unquote pure. And it was literally this idea that even and the book opens with this sort of dream, right, of the author where he's marrying his dream partner or whatever, and everyone behind him, there was all these women lined up behind him, and it was all the people that he had kissed or been in a relationship with prior. And so it was just this really, really, it sent a lot of communities that I was a part of into this really deep, to be blunt, patriarchal and misogynistic
completely.
path of you know, the separation of our bodies, you know, that Tara you're describing, and like even to the point where literally kissing someone would be considered, it's not okay.
Yeah, it's a sin.
Yeah. And at the same time, I was, because this was so, I'll be honest with you, at the age of 14 and 15, this was considered kind of taboo. Sex was taboo, especially coming from church. I saw an ad for a youth sexual health organization in my high school, and they were offering like a $25 honorarium, and I was like, damn, that's like more than my my monthly allowance. And I get to do this like sneaky thing and learn about sex. But so this organization, and I still work for them, you know, 22 years later. But you know, they held a focus group. They were trying to build a youth sexual health organization, or sorry, a website but was really based on like feminist you know, anti-oppressive principles. And so at the same time, I was sort of learning these, I was telling Jen right before this call, like I was literally told in a Sunday school class, for example, that if you look into a microscope at a condom, there were pores where the HIV virus could like swim through. And so at the same time, and so I could sort of, you know, be in conversation with what was happening. And so I was curious. I mean, not to get there, I have many, many stories of that type, but I'm like, so that was sort of like my, in terms of hearing what I was learning in church, but also figuring out, and also, you know, I was quite in the closet at that time too, navigating my own identity. It was sort of where I guess you could say, encountered like a path that I went down in terms of love intersections and figuring out like identity and whatnot. And so I'm curious, like what was that like opening for you? Because if I've said this to Jen too, if I didn't sign up for that sexual health focus group, I don't know where I would have been, where I would have ended up.
Yeah. And I think that just speaks to how powerful it is when we're able to get comprehensive sex education. Because a big part of growing up in this evangelical subculture that created purity culture is that we didn't have sex education. We had abstinence only education, which is not sex education. And to the extreme, not just that you can't have sex until you're married. Like that was the fundamental cornerstone of purity culture, right? But it went so much further than that to police the clothing that we wore. Like if I were as a teenager to show up wearing a tank top like this in church, I would have been pulled aside and my clothing would have been policed, and I would have been given a lecture that just created so much shame within ourselves that my shoulders were so tantalizing. Throw everyone into the lustful, sinful, like oh my gosh, that's what we grew up with, right? That you can tempt someone just to think lustful thoughts, and your thoughts could even be a sin. Not even what you acted upon, but your very thoughts were policed, right? And so,
well, you see that. Sorry to interrupt, but we see that seeping over not in non-religious contexts in schools, right, where there's a dress code in public schools, and of course students and you know, are either sent home, specifically girls, are sent home for wearing a mere tank top because they're somehow tantalizing their you know, peers and male students and teachers. Even it's such a grotesque way of looking at developing bodies. Like
Yeah.
it's gross.
And it makes us think that there's something wrong with our
Wrong.
bodies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
There must be something shameful about my body if I have to hide it, or if it creates such an illicit response in someone that could be so negative. Right? And so this is where that shame cycle comes in then. Because what happens when shame is present is we feel like we have to distance ourselves from that piece of ourselves then, because
Yeah.
Right.
it's bad, and therefore we are bad. And we sever this piece of ourselves, and it's heartbreaking. It's so sad. And so now the work that I do with my clients, who not every single one comes from a religious background, not every single person that I work with has grown up in purity culture, but a large percentage of the people that I work with do. And this is because we realize now, with all of the new information and new research that is coming out about bodies and neurobiology and trauma, is that trauma is something that doesn't just happen in our mind. Yes, it can impact the way that our brains develop and function, but it lives inside of our bodies. And so if we want to heal from trauma that we have, maybe that is created through that severing that happens through purity culture, when we separate and distance ourselves from our bodies or from parts of who we are, our queerness, our creativity, maybe our Asianness, whatever it is, because we've been told that it was bad or that it was shameful or sinful, something that we need to hide, we separate, and then that lives in our bodies. Because we distance ourselves from a piece of who we are. And to heal, we have to feel it. We have to come back into relationship with it. And so that's what's so devastating about purity culture. And I think having this conversation amongst the three of us too, and everyone that is watching as well, is that we're coming from it from a different perspective as well too, having the Asian American perspective and a queer perspective, because so much of purity culture, whether it was experienced in the school system dress codes or whether it's experienced in the church itself, still the church has been incredibly influential in wider society as a whole. So when we're talking about these issues of oppression and liberation and injustice, we also have to talk about the way that Christianity has been colonized and has been so intertwined with the building of the society that we live in and breathe and exist in today. Like they're so intertwined that you can't even, there's no separation of church and state, quite honestly, right? So if we want to understand these oppressive things that are based on body-based oppression that live in our world today, we have to talk about the way that the religious aspects have seeped into our society as a whole, right? And
I
so
love,
go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say, I love what you said, that I've never even thought of thinking about the Christian origins as being actually a BIPOC religion. I don't know if that's ever clocked in my brain, but that's
Yeah. There's no white Jesus. White Jesus doesn't exist. White Jesus
Jesus
is
is brown.
Jesus
Jesus
is
is
brown.
brown.
Yeah,
Jesus was brown and
yeah.
very radical and very for the people, and flipped tables when people were being financially
He was a
exploited by
Marxist.
hierarchies.
A
Oh
Marxist.
yeah. Like she was full on
Yeah.
throwing riots, And I think
Yeah.
that's an origin story that a lot of people forget. And so I think it's so important, like the version of Christianity that we see and interact with now today, most of the time is not true to its origins at all.
I'm glad you brought that up, that kind of that intersection of race and religion, spirituality, and our genders and sexualities, and kind of drawing back to the origin story of Love Intersections. Was David and I, at the time, it was 8 years ago, we were sitting on the Vancouver School Board's Pride Advisory Committee, and we were updating a 10-year-old policy to make schools in Vancouver safer for transgender students. And we were heavily protested by predominantly conservative Chinese Christian parents, and the ways in which we saw, and so it was a huge media controversy surrounding this, because hundreds of people signed up to speak either for or against this policy update. And I remember sitting in those school board meetings that were very lengthy and laborious, and I have my queer community behind me, and sitting directly across from me, the kind of the opposing side, were, were parents, were people that look like me, that look like my parents, and we share the same like skin. And the way that we saw the predominantly white media report on this controversy was, quite frankly, really racist, and it painted Chinese people as a monolith. And I always share this story as like an origin story, because from there, like I just even remember one time we left for dinner, and this older white lesbian turned to me and asked, "So what is it about, your culture that is more homophobic?" And when I told David this, we then wrote a couple of pieces that of writing that described our respective upbringings, and then those writings kind of quickly went viral, in which David described his upbringing in the evangelical community as a queer person, and I talked about my Buddhist upbringing in Taiwan, and like my intersections with spirituality was through this like kind of Buddhist lens, which was kind of less binary. So we shared our experiences through that kind of like spiritual lens and our experiences. So I just want to, go ahead.
And that reminds me too. I mean, that was part of what I felt wasn't being said. And I know I opened it with a very, with my own traumatic experience of the purity culture, but part of what I didn't feel was heard in the representations of the media, and also in that story that Jen shared was, my coming out wasn't easy, but it actually was my community really deeply accepted who I was as well.
I'm so glad.
But that story wasn't really being told as well, and they just sort of painted this sort of like conservative Chinese Christians. You must have had a horrible
Meanwhile,
time.
We don't say that the same thing to like, because it was during that time too, where this group, this very fringe group out in Langley, that was really protesting a lot of this policy and was targeting LGBTQ organizations, which at the time I was working in. And we don't say that, we don't call the
white Anglo-Saxon
people, we don't call
Christians
them homophobic, right?
Oh, I know who you're talking about.
Do you probably know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
And to me, it's so, again, it's heartbreaking and it's sad because it shows me that people don't know church history, quite honestly. And I have a whole chapter that goes into this in my book that's coming out next year. And it's such like you said, it's such a narrow view of what it means to be human, quite honestly. But it's a narrow view of sexuality. It's a narrow view of gender. It's a narrow view of all of us. And we are so much more expansive than that. And even when I read scriptures, and I don't share this to be any kind of like, I don't want to convert anyone. I'm not trying to be evangelical. I'm trying to just set the record straight and say, hey, what we're interacting, like, this is a facade. This is this modern mainstream, the majority of Christianity today that we're interacting with is a very politicized version with an agenda for profit and power. And it's not
like most religions.
And it is not true to its original origins. That is very radical. That is indigenous in nature, right? It's not true to that whatsoever. Like, when we read the scriptures, when you actually read that, there is so many different references to a femininity of God, not just a masculine God, but a femininity of God. And so you see this very gender non-conforming, gender fluid, expansive experience of spirituality, of divinity that actually exists in the scriptures that we just don't talk about. We just completely erased it, right? And what is more like a God that becomes human, whether we believe that this is a metaphor or a mythical story, or whether it actually happened in practicality, what is more like trans than something that transforms in that way, right? Like, what is more queer than some of the stories that exist? Like, if people read the stories about like David and his best friend Jonathan, the story of like, there are some real queer stories.
They were roommates,
right? You know, so people are just they're erasing this beautiful legacy that exists of queer and transgender Christians, of BIPOC Christians, of feminist and womanist theology that exists in the Bible. And we've instead replaced it with this very narrow, very colonized, very politicized, very disembodied, and honestly, quite frankly, traumatic version of spirituality in the Christian sense. And it's not really doing anyone any favors, right? And so I think it's really important to make that distinction between the two, because then you can see people, and I see this with my clients all the time, oh, maybe that there's space for my spirituality and my sexuality to coexist. And that I'm not being contradictory in being the fullness of who I am. Maybe there are people who are like me, right? Maybe there's more, maybe there's more, maybe there's more. And I just think that, to me, that's so exciting. And my whole body gets tingles when I think of, oh, maybe there's more to our human experience than we can encounter. Maybe there's more than this narrow bit that we've been sold so far.
Yeah, Jen, you and I have talked about this too, because it's, when we started Love Intersections too, it was sort of that, I think we've touched on it too. It comes from this sort of, a lot of trauma that a lot of, Christians or people with that sort of experience, and they don't see that or can feel that sort of connection between their sexuality and their spirituality could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, I want to go back to that intersection of race again, just because David and I, that's kind of all we talk about and jam about, is like our racialized experience in like our very specific and unique bodies. I'm curious if you have any, how do you, in terms of how you reconcile your own racial identity with your sexuality, with your experience. Can you tell us more about that?
I'm also curious, I want to ask a question before I forget about your use of traditional Chinese medicine as well.
Yeah. Okay. So these are such beautiful, rich questions. For me, a lot of the work that I'm doing is unlearning and then rebuilding, right? So especially because I grew up in a biracial home. So my dad was born and raised in Singapore. My grandfather was from China. So I'm Chinese Singaporean on my dad's side. And then on my maternal side, I say early colonizers. Like I don't sugarcoat it.
You're allowed.
It's true. Like my mom's side of the family has been in Canada for over, like we celebrated when I was 13, we celebrated like 100 years on the homestead, right? So like we came over pretty early from Europe. We're early European settlers on my mom's side. And so I think that it's important to speak about it in that way. And so, she's like Scottish, Irish, Icelandic, English. So I have this biracial identity, and it's complex. And when I speak to a lot of people who are biracial Asian, there's this complexity as well too of often feeling not enough in one community or too much in another community, or also feeling like this erasure as well too. Like I've had so many people say things that are actually quite hurtful when they say like, oh, like you're whitewashed Asian or things like that. And I'm like, well, I'm actually just as Asian as I am on my European side. And because I grew up in a Christian and deeply Christian, evangelical, very conservative family home, there's a lot of things of my upbringing and my traditional teachings that are just missing. Right? There's a lot of cultural traditions that are not passed down. Like when I'm hearing you, Jen, speak about the spirituality that you got to experience, like I was taught, oh, all of those traditions, all of those spiritualities, like that's demonic.
That's right.
Right? It's so sad to me because they're beautiful traditions, beautiful teachings that I would love to know and be able to incorporate into my day-to-day, because it makes me actually feel much more connection to a whole side of myself that I feel distanced from because of my Christian upbringing, because everything else Christianity is fearful of. And so there's a lot of that I'm still reconciling, if I'm being really honest about. I'm still unlearning a lot of things. I'm decolonizing a lot of things and deconstructing a lot of things. And I'm finding my way back to a home that incorporates all of me. And, the same thing even with my relationship with traditional Chinese medicine. I mean, right now, I don't know when this is going to be airing, but right now, like I said, I'm 3 weeks postpartum of with my third child. And I've been nourishing my body with a lot of traditional Chinese medicine practices of
Wow.
postpartum. Like I'm doing the month of 40 days staying at home.
You are. Oh my goodness.
I am. Yeah. I mean, I'm
That's
modifying it. Like I'm still
yeah.
showering and
Yeah,
things
yeah,
like
yeah.
that. But I
Well,
am staying home when I'm drinking the teas and the soups and
Wow.
doing belly binding, like Malaysian practices there and all
Yeah,
those
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
things, right?
That's
I,
commitment.
It
I
is.
have
I
a
love it though.
You
It's
do?
it's
yeah,
really
yeah.
it's been
I
really
have
deeply nourishing to just slow down, and I
Mhm.
I love it. I don't feel like I'm missing out on anything by staying
Mhm.
home.
I mean, do
yeah.
you want to just explain what the
Mm,
坐月, like what that practice is in kind
Mm,
of traditional Chinese medicinal kind of practice, like what the
mhm.
49 days, what that month entails, or the 2 months entails for, for bodies that have given birth.
Yeah, well, I'm no expert by any means. Again, this is a lot of my like work of decolonizing and reconnecting. But my experience I can speak to, and it's about replenishing, restoring, and balancing back the body. Right, like your body goes through so much to conceive, to give birth. I'm breastfeeding, so I'm nourishing my son now as well too from my own body, and as an embodiment practitioner, like that, it speaks so deeply to me of the magic of the body and what the
yeah.
body is capable of, and I'm just in awe and wanting to honor the body, and that's part of why I'm doing this practice as well too, of just really going slowly with myself, and I think that there's a lot of intersections that that this that this intersects with, that this connects with as well too, because as I've been going through and sharing this process on my social media, so many people are saying, I wish that this was part of my cultural practice. I wish North
Yeah.
American or European practices had these stay home, nourish yourself. Like, let's strip away this idea that we have to bounce back our bodies, that we have to make it look like we never gave birth, that we have to fit back into this productive, like, hamster wheel that really is very capitalist, quite
Yes.
honestly, that is
Yeah.
based on the production of our bodies rather than the care of our bodies, rather than the nourishment, the healing of our bodies. And so, even
Mhm.
for that alone, I love that, like, this is my anti-capitalist way of like healing from giving birth and saying, like, my body is on no timeline to maintain anybody's expectations or look a certain way or produce in a certain way. I'm not rushing to come back to work. I'm
Yeah.
taking my time. And it's been as artists, both yourself as well, it's been very deeply creative, and it's just been
Mhm.
giving me a just such a beautiful opportunity to, like, to just be,
Yeah.
and it's been
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the traditional Chinese medicine because it was also a journey that I've been kind of going through, kind of in the
Mhm.
middle of when we started Love Intersections, because a lot of practices were considered pagan, right?
Yeah.
Um, but also, I
Mhm.
found really funny, like it's very selective which ones are. Like, I'll
Mm.
still bow at the great, like, so for example, the
Mhm.
the no idols thing. So we didn't
Yeah.
practice like the burning of the joss paper. We didn't have an altar in the home, but we would still
Mhm.
literally bow in front of our grandparents, like
Mm.
tombstones and stuff. So anyway, I thought it was now that
That's
I'm
very
trying to,
interesting.
now that I'm trying to like relearn the practices, I'm like I find it quite selective which ones which ones were pagan.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
but like as and but so if for so for example, like my family really also strongly followed traditional Chinese medicine. And when the pandemic hit, and so I share the story a lot, but my dad has four sisters, and they were the sort of the holders of like the soups or the tonic
Okay.
traditions in my family.
Mm.
And they used to always deliver these soups to me like literally every week based on what your body needed, like seasonally and
Mm.
whatnot. And so it was sort of like and so during the pandemic, when I started making the soups, to learning and making the soups and delivering to them now that they're like in their 80s, and to sort of try to
Yeah.
continue what was like a communal practice that
Yes.
we couldn't do during quarantine. But
I love that.
it's interesting hearing you talk about that. I'm now also recognizing that, like, how those practices, thinking about your postpartum Chinese medicine practice as also an embodied practice too.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, Jen, we've been thinking about this through some of our food practice work, and what it
Mm-hmm.
means to actually do, especially as like racialized folks, and
Yeah.
to learn and sort of practice our culture, and what that brings into our bodies,
Yes.
quite literally,
Yes.
but
Food
also
is
like,
such a
yeah,
beautiful embodiment practice.
yeah,
Absolutely. And how we nourish
mhm,
ourselves at our ancestral foods, all of
yeah,
these things it's so beautiful. I love it so much. And even the collective aspect of community care, yes, of like bringing people soups and meals. Like I love that you did that. But hot pot is a very collective experience,
This is very
right?
hot pot.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah,
love that. And
Yeah,
it's the shifting away from a very individualistic, like
totally.
when I've worked with my clients, there's one in particular that is coming to mind. And I was asking her, like, how do you practice right relationship with all things? And she was so confused. She's like very Southern United States. The majority of my clients actually come from the States and international, but I actually have
mhm,
more American clients than Canadian clients, which is so interesting. Um,
mhm,
but she was so confused when I was asking her this question of how do you practice right relationship with all things. And so we started to have this exploratory conversation about how do you be in right relationship with the food that you eat, with the clothes that you wear, with not just being right relationship with your body and right relationship with the people around you, but how are you in right relationship with everything in a way
mm,
that honors the the things that we're interacting with, right? That
yeah,
is mindful of where the food comes from, for example, how the food is prepared, how do we hold relationship with all of these things, and then how does that foster the relationship that we have with one another? I think these are
mm,
beautiful things for us to meditate on. And for
mm,
me, when I do meditate on these things, it brings so much appreciation to me.
mm,
Like it brings so much gratitude of where these things come from, the way that they sustain my body, the way that I, give back to one another through the honoring of all things, being in right relationship with all things. It switches from a very, again, capitalist and colonial mindset where everything and everyone is a resource
yeah,
to everything and everyone is in relationship and wholeness and
yeah,
reciprocity. And
yeah.
and that for me has been an embodiment practice that has been so life-giving and even spiritual in a sense too.
Yeah, I kind of have. Maybe this is maybe you are. That was the answer that you're going to give for this
Mm.
question I'm about to ask. But I read somewhere that I think maybe it's the title of your book, right?
Yeah.
Healing our relationships with our bodies, each other, and the earth. And I'm
Yeah.
this is on the back of my mind because the Hot Pot Talks we filmed yesterday with Rita Wong, who
Mm.
is a climate justice activist, and has
Mhm.
part of what she was discussing was her, and she's a Chinese Canadian, and she talks about like her journey in trying to develop or foster, cultivate right relations with Indigenous communities,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
and I know we've been kind of touching on this, but I'm also curious, like because your book and your work around what you've just described, sort of being in right relations with others, but also the world around us. How does I'm
Mhm.
curious, can you maybe expand a little bit upon the connections to your embodiment and sexuality practice and the right relations with the earth, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is such a complex thing. But for me, when it comes to viewing my body in right relationship and being in a right relationship with myself and my body, it changes the way that I view everything around me, right? So when I recognize that my body comes from the earth and will one day return to the earth, it makes me think differently about the earth in general, right? When my body goes through, from a sexuality perspective or just an embodied perspective, when my body goes through this life death cycle, not only just like the big life death cycle that we're all going to be part of, we're all born, we're all going to die, we're all going to come from the earth,
Mm,
return to the earth, but for me, living in a feminine body, the fact that I have a womb, that I have ovaries, that I menstruate, not right now because I just gave birth, but normally would menstruate with every moon cycle, right? That there is a birth and a death that happens within me every month. And even again, kind of like what we talked about at the very start of our conversation, when we're birthing new things, in us and in the world around us, in discovering new parts of who we are, or bringing a new creative project into existence. Like there's a birth-death cycle that we all engage in, right? And so recognizing that we're part of that, for me, has been really, really powerful. It's given me so much more reverence for the earth, and in something that, to my knowledge, that maybe you know more than I do, but because I'm still learning so many things about my traditional ancestry on my Asian side. But when I finish these 40 days, I want to create my own little like reemergence ritual where I'm honoring the postpartum time of the 40 days, and kind of I have my placenta in my freezer, and I plan on giving it back to the earth. And having, it's been something that has nourished my baby. It's something that, I've taken care to nourish myself in this postpartum time. And I want to bring it back to the earth, and it's going to decompose and make this beautiful, rich soil again too. Right. And so it's recognizing that these things all kind of intertwine and have relationships and live and breathe and weave and exist together, right?
I just got a flash of in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. There's like I'm just thinking about like my queer, feminist, lesbian mentors and mamas who, if they had given birth, they would always incorporate the placenta somehow in some kind of ritual. Some would even consume them into.
Oh yeah, I was like,
because
that's still a thing.
I'm so very like earthy and crunchy in that way. I guess. And I think too, like, we just don't have to get squeamish about things of the body. No, right? We don't have to get squeamish about things of sexuality and be all hush hush and taboo about it. We don't have to be squeamish about things of the body either. The body is good. The body is profoundly good and wise and whole. And if we just treated the body in relation, and we're in relationship with the body, rather than as this like inanimate this thing, this like, we hear people say like, oh, this is just the meat suit that I walk around the world in that gets me from like point A to point B. But no, if the body was something that we approached with such reverence, that we saw the wisdom of the body and the way that the body is speaking to us all the time through our somatic sensations, through our nervous system responses, like the body is always giving us feedback and information. And if we treated that as a conversation as we moved throughout the day, that we're in relationship with our bodies, man, how profoundly different could our experience be, rather than just seeing our body as like the sum of all the parts, this mechanism, this machine that just gets us from here to there, but rather something that is living, breathing in existence and wants to speak to us and wants to share wisdom with it. Man, like there's so much more for us.
No, I love that.
Yeah, I particularly love like, and I'm just using a different word in my mind, is just this biohacking in terms of like how I learn from the wisdoms of my body and what it's telling me. And David knows this because every month I go through the cycles, and because I chart everything, and it's my cycle is very is very on time. So I, every week I can schedule, these are the important meetings that I'll schedule when I'm ovulating. These are the meetings that I don't schedule very much before my period, which is currently, I'm very PMS right now. I was just telling David this. But he has heard me, because David and I work so intimately close together, that every single month he'll hear the exact, the repetition of like, okay, let's go, versus I am not at all here.
I'm like that too. Like when I'm ovulating, not only am I like really much more like juicy and sexual in my body, but I'm like so creative and I'm wanting to be so much more productive, and I've got all the energy to do all the things.
Exactly.
And like this shouldn't be something that we have to be hush hush about. It shouldn't be something that is weird. Like this is part of our humanity. The sexual aspect is part of our humanity. The hormonal aspect is part of our humanity. And how do we nurture that? How do we be in relationship with that? But also how do we nurture that? And not only from a mindfulness and embodiment practice, like lately, especially going through this postpartum period and being so intentional with what I'm eating, I've been learning so much about how you eat for each part of your cycle, and how do you actually nourish yourself. And again, this feels like a very like anti-patriarchal, anti-colonial way of living, because especially for those of us who live in assigned female bodies, like we've been taught that like smallness, right? Like make yourself small, not just in your body, like diet culture, very patriarchal, very colonial, very white supremacist, but also in the way that you just take up space and show up in the world as well too. Make yourself small, be smaller, be less threatening, right? And I think that even can intersect with the way that we see a lot of Asians showing up as well too, right? Like, oh, like we're not going to rock the boat, we're going to be polite, and we're going to, right? And like that comes from, we don't want to experience the same level of racism or violence that we see other BIPOC communities experiencing, right? So we've become the model minority so that we're not so threatening, so that we've made ourselves smaller, more agreeable, more polite, you know, there are all of those stereotypes that exist, right? And so me just not only nourishing my body properly so that I'm not trying to make myself smaller and smaller and smaller, but that changes my relationship with, I'm going to take up the space that is mine in the world. And that doesn't mean taking away from anybody else's space. That just means, how do I live the fullness of who I am and embody that in a way that is honest and raw and true and authentic to me, the most human that I can be for me. And that's been radically life-changing as well.
Tara, I'm curious. So you mentioned you have a book coming out. What do you have any other projects coming up?
I've always had projects coming up.
I thought so.
A lot of them are still in this creating space that aren't quite ready to be shared within the world. But one thing I am really excited about, now that I'm almost done all the editing and revisions of my book so that it can send off to the printer, it's going to be coming out next May of 2023, which is right in the middle of AAPI month. So I'm really, really excited about that. That feels really deeply important to me, that my publisher intentionally chose that date. But now that is kind of like starting to wind down that process, and also that the pandemic is starting to get to a point where we can relate in person again soon, depending on people's levels of comfort. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder, is this a trick because we've gone back and forth so much?
Totally. Yeah.
But I'm really looking forward to getting back into community, in-person community with people. As you mentioned at the start when you were introducing me, I've hosted women's circles and community dinners and things like that, these gatherings where we come together in person. And I think that that's such a beautiful experience, something that is, as glad as I am to have been able to create these little pockets of community online with people all around the world over the last couple of years. There's something about being in person that is just so special, breaking bread together, having hot dog together, having a meal together, cooking together in the kitchen. Like maybe that's my auntie side of like, you know, wanting to like put all the spices together in the kitchen and just like feed everybody and here spoon some more into your bowl. But there's something magical and special about that, right? And so I'm really looking forward to getting back to in-person community events that I can host, and we can have these kind of conversations like this, talking about real, deep, complex intersections of justice and spirituality and sexuality and gender and embodiment, all of these things. We were having these events in person before, and I'm so excited to get back to that. So that's something that I'm going to start back up again this summer and fall, and I can't wait.
Yeah, I'm a little bit nervous. I'm organizing some in-person events that have been also canceled like 5 times because of COVID.
Right?
But it's also giving me anxiety too, because now it's like, you know, of course there's layers of, you know, making sure the space is right and the catering and whatnot. But then it's also like the COVID safety and
accessibility.
Yes.
Yeah.
Accessibility is so important, and it's been so pronounced over this pandemic, which I'm glad we're having to look at that, because it's been something that has been left out of our conversations for so long.
Yeah. Yeah. We were just talking about this yesterday too. I mean, like even, you know, as much as, people, you know, folks with disabilities have been wanting, you know, have been advocating for online for so long. And it's only just now that everyone else has had to adapt that it's being made much more accessible. So
and those are things that I think are beautiful things that have come out of this experience that we've all gone through around the world. And I hope that they stay, honestly, truly. I hope that there are some things that have been innovative that we're going to continue on, because I think that those things are so valuable.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious, switching gears a little bit. I'm wondering if you have any mentors or coaches that you work with,
Mm,
or who people or communities that you're inspired by,
mhm.
that are generative for you. Because
Yeah.
I think like for when we do intergenerational work too, like it's so hard to find other mentors and
Yeah.
coaches for
I think
mentors and coaches.
exactly. And I think it's especially hard in the intersections that we're all coming from. Like, it's very hard for me to find queer mentors that are elders, right? For very obvious reasons. Like, there's an entire generation that is missing. And especially coming from like a Christian, queer Christian, or I don't actually identify as Christian myself anymore, post-Christian, post-evangelical, ex-evangelical. But somebody who has come from this community,
Yeah.
and is queer and Christian, or queer and post-Christian. I mean, because so many people were so in hiding for so
Yeah.
long.
Yeah.
It's really hard to find those. And then because the church is very white dominated, it's very hard to find somebody who's Asian, or biracial even. So there's not a lot out there, unfortunately, that are elders that I can look to. But there are beautiful communities that I belong to. I mean, a few that have names. Like, there's like, I'm part of this community and it has a name and it's associated with this organization or this movement. But then there's a lot that are just so grassroots that they're just people who like get around the kitchen table, and we gather in cafes, and we gather in people's homes, and we're in relationship with one another, and we have picnics at the beach, right? And so some have names and some don't have names.
Yeah.
But I love, like, I'll shout out like the Institute for Somatic Sex Education. Like, I've learned so much from the very diverse, beautiful people who bring their whole selves into that community, where I've studied alongside them and learned from them, and had the privilege of hearing and witnessing their stories. The She Loves community, which is women and femmes of faith all around the world that are doing liberation work. Like, I've loved what they have been doing, and I've been part of their community for so many years, speaking at events, writing for them, being at in-person events, baby showers, all kinds of things, like these things spill over into our everyday lives, right?
Yeah.
And I work with One TWU, which is specifically for Trinity students out in Langley that deal with that you have been talking about on a regular basis. And they're queer students who exist at a very Christian liberal arts, very fundamentalist liberal arts university that has honestly been quite hostile to queer kids. And so I love being part of what they're doing, and the beautiful work that very resistance work that they're doing, just by living and showing up and in the fullness of who they are every single day. Like, our existence is the resistance a lot of times. And I think that's been that perspective of living and existing and breathing in these communities has been so beautiful for me, because I spent 10 years being like very, very politicized in my activism.
Advocacy?
I'm trying to say advocacy and activism at the same time.
That's great. It's a good hybrid word.
Advocatism. That's great.
That's great. Advocacy.
But I worked in Ottawa, and I lived 6 blocks from the Hill, and I worked on the Hill, and I was part of a team that amended the criminal code twice for anti-human trafficking and these exploitive gender issues and stuff like that, right? And so I did a lot of work in that felt like I was fighting a fight every single day. And sometimes that's great, and sometimes that's exhausting, right? To always feel like we're fighting the system, dismantling the system, resisting oppression, and sometimes just my thriving, our living in a way that is defiant to the status quo, that is defiant to the body-based systems of oppression and hierarchy and power that live and exist in our world today. Sometimes just showing up in the fullness of who I am is defiant to those things. Showing up and embracing my body in the fullness of who she is defiant to those things, which is why my book is called Your Body is a Revolution, right? Like, can the way that we live and breathe and exist in our communities, in relationship with one another, in relationship to ourselves, how does that show up in defiance of the status quo? How does that dismantle the system and disrupt these these very capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal ways of being and holding relationship with one another, how does it shift the tide just by being who we are and not hiding that anymore? And so, I love these communities. I'm excited to be back in person with a lot of these communities. And I love the communities that have formed online as well, too. I think that they're deeply important and they're so nourishing for all of us.
I'm also curious, one thing that's coming to mind is I haven't gone to church in a very long time, but I've also noticed, though, it's been, obviously the churches that I've attended have been very different from the one I grew up in, but I've also noticed like a really interesting like shift that like there's a lot of like queer affirming work that's being done, which I remember this is like even 10 years ago when I used to see it. I used to latch on so much and like, take all my money. You are doing really important work. But it seems to be like, that seems to be a really growing, from what I'm witnessing anyways, body of
we get
work.
invited to present at churches quite frequently. The Langley Church, the Langley United Church. We have a few connections.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you're getting those invites. That's so important.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm just curious, like what you have witnessed too in terms of shifts in that.
I have, I have witnessed that shift, and there's a couple interesting things that are really happening right now. One is they're calling this like deconstructing faith, right? It's now has a name and a label, and so it's really interesting because it feels a lot like how, if you look at church history, there's different reformations that have happened, right? Throughout the centuries worth of history. And it feels like we're kind of going through one of those right now. And part of it for a lot of people is seeing the way that the church has failed so deeply in being inclusive for people who are BIPOC, for queer, trans, BIPOC, all of this, like they've so terribly dropped the ball in caring for people who are queer and caring for people who are people of color, even the treatment of just women, which was for me was one of the first things that I started really publicly questioning. I have a TED Talk that I did in 2016 about Jesus and feminism. And I started really challenging these ideas of like, okay, so like headship and submission and like, really, like, there's not more for women, so publicly questioning these things. And it's been interesting because collectively, I'm not the only one who has had these questions. I'm not the only one who is taking apart all the pieces of my faith and really looking at them and inspecting them and deconstructing them and looking at all these pieces and saying, like, is this true? Is this even accurate? Does this faith, does it manifest in my life, making me a better person who is actually more loving and compassionate and inclusive and kind? Or is it making me more skeptical? Is it making me more fearful? Is it making me more exclusive, more critical? I'm having all those conversations with myself that I started years and years ago. And so because of that, I've since walked away from my faith because I've witnessed the way that the church has responded to things politically, the way that the church has responded to things like Trump, the way that the church has responded to the pandemic, the way that the church has responded to scandal after scandal after scandal, the way that the church has responded to people who are queer, people who are like me. All of this has made me step away from that line of thinking. And I'm not the only one. Thousands and thousands of people, not just even around North America, like all around the world, have stepped away from Christianity because of what we've seen in the last 7 to 10 years. And a lot of us were questioning these things long before, but the things that we've been collectively walking through together over the last 7 to 10 years, so many people said, like, this is not what I want to be part of anymore. And so you are seeing the shift. And at the same time, you're seeing people go back to scripture, kind of like what we said previously, of being like, oh, well, actually, if you strip away all of the politicized narratives that have been tacked on to Christianity, when you get critical of white Jesus and you realize, oh, actually, it has very radical roots. Oh, it has BIPOC roots. Oh, like Jesus was a brown indigenous man who was died of state-sanctioned violence. Like, there's a lot of similarities into what Jesus's life was and what we're walking through today, and realizing how far it's come because it's aligned itself with a political narrative. And I think it's so interesting because you also at the same time see this pushback, right? You see this pushback, and it's like talks about the culture wars and the times and the gay agenda, and like, dude, like, my gay agenda is I just want to live. I just want queer kids to survive. You know,
Well, that's why it's why sometimes I'm a little bit suspicious. I watch very carefully because it's kind of,
Totally.
I've seen, like, for example, churches who have lost a lot of attendance shift all of a sudden to when they
Social
recognize that
justice.
now, hey, switch to social justice, because now they're being called out for being the sort of the enemy, if you will, and then shifting the language. And so I've been kind of paying attention because I hope that, and when I've seen some activism come out of some church communities that I've come up with that are really, really doing the work of trying to
some really, really are.
Yeah, absolutely. And then some I'm just like, what is this language that you're using now?
It's always suspicious. The last hurrah, I think, of the gay rights movement was now seeing the Pride Parade. It's just banks and churches marching in the parade.
And absolutely. And so those are things that are worth being skeptical, having a healthy level of skepticism over, right? Because again, like, it's like this commodity of body all over again, right? Whether that be pride parades and like pride watching during like June during Pride Month, right? And like every bank and every corporation has something to say about that, and churches can be no different, right? But like, how do you show up all the time? Are you doing the like hard internal reflective work to see the way that your homophobia, transphobia, racism, ableism, all of these things show up in your body, right? Like, this is a visceral body experience. Not only has the oppression been body based, like, look, every injustice in the world begins with the body and the isms and the othering that we do towards one another, right? So if we want to heal these things that have created such deep severance and such injustice in our world, and we want liberation, we got to go back to the body as well too, and look at the way that these things show up in our nervous system, show up in our somatics, and the way that we relate to one another. When somebody gets deeply offensive and because they're not wanting to see their own internalized racism, well, that comes from the body, that comes from being in relationship with the body, and we can only heal it by going back to the body as well. And then when we change that in our bodies, when I'm more compassionate to my body, when I'm more understanding of the way trauma shows up in my body, then the way that I view everyone else in their bodies is different too, because it forces me to see them in their humanity as well too. See them the way that they might be showing up in the middle of a trigger or trauma response. And these things have a ripple effect.
That's beautiful. Right? Well, we are running out of time, so we will have to ask our favorite question of Hot Pot Talks, which is, what is your favorite hot pot ingredient or experience or story?
How do I even pick something like that? I mean, I love this, like, all the different like spices and sauces and like hot sauces and stuff like that I can put on it. It just kind of gives me this like multi-layered, like, more complex flavor to everything. And I think that like that actually is even so reflective of the conversation that we've had, saying like all of these things are so nuanced and they're so complex and they're so layered, and they deepen the more that we get to savor them and taste the way that everything changes over time. And so I don't know, that's the best answer that I can give you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tara, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This was really great. This was a wonderful, nourishing conversation as we talked about all the life things and all the hot things.
All right, don't go away. We'll say bye in a second. Great. Well, thanks, everyone, and we will catch you on the next episode of Hot Pot Talks.
Bye.